Paul McCartney, a name that reshaped the soundscape of the 20th century. To speak of him is to speak of melody itself, of a voice that captured an era, and of a songwriter whose words became the secret language of millions. He wasn't born into privilege or fame, but into the grit and charm of Liverpool, a working-class port city still recovering from the devastation of World War II. Out of that soot and smoke rose a boy with a battered guitar, a notebook full of chords, and a heart full of dreams. Dreams that would one day echo through stadiums and define generations. James Paul McCartney entered the world on June 18, 1942. His father, Jim, was a cotton salesman who once led a local jazz band, and his mother, Mary, was a nurse and midwife, the calm anchor of the family. Their home was modest but alive with music, conversation, and hope. Yet, when Paul was only 14, tragedy tore that world apart. Mary died from complications of breast cancer surgery, a loss that carved a wound so deep it would forever shape his songwriting. Decades later, when he sang "Mother Mary Comes to Me," speaking words of wisdom, let it be, it wasn't just a lyric. It was a son reaching for the memory of his mother, transforming grief into grace. Yesterday, Let It Be, and countless other songs have become emotional bridges between his private sorrow and the world's shared longing. In the midst of pain, music became Paul's sanctuary. His father recognized his gift and encouraged him to learn piano and guitar. Paul would spend long evenings scribbling lyrics in tattered notebooks, experimenting with melodies until they felt just right. He had an instinctive sense of harmony, the ability to craft tunes that sounded both timeless and new. In post-war Liverpool, where opportunities were few and dreams often stayed dreams, Paul's talent became his lifeline. By the mid-1950s, Liverpool was alive with a new sound, skiffle. Every corner cafe and school hall buzzed with young people strumming guitars, banging washboards, and mimicking the energy of American rock and roll. It was in this atmosphere that fate stepped in. At a small church fete in 1957, a 15-year-old Paul met an older boy named John Lennon, who was fronting a band called the Quarrymen. Paul, shy but confident, impressed John by tuning a guitar properly and then performing Eddie Cochran's 20 Flight Rock flawlessly from memory. That single moment changed music history. John saw in Paul not just skill, but charisma and drive. Within weeks, Paul was invited to join the band, and a creative partnership was born that would go on to redefine popular music. Soon after, another Liverpool teenager, George Harrison, joined the fold. Quiet, sharp, and extraordinarily talented on guitar. Together, with a rotating cast of drummers before Ringo Starr completed the lineup, they began forging a sound that would electrify the world. But those early days were far from glamorous. Long before fame and fortune, there were cold nights, cheap lodging, and endless gigs in the rough clubs of Hamburg, Germany. The young Beatles played for hours on end, sometimes 8 sets a night, performing to drunken sailors and rowdy crowds. They lived in cramped rooms, slept in bunk beds, and survived on scraps of bread and canned food. Yet it was in Hamburg that Paul truly found his voice, his stamina, and his understanding of what it meant to perform. Night after night, he learned how to hold an audience, how to command a stage, and how to polish the raw energy that would soon captivate the globe. Even then, a duality defined Paul McCartney. He was both the dreamer and the strategist, the romantic who wrote "And I Love Her," and the pragmatist who insisted the band wear suits to appeal to a wider audience. He could see beyond the next gig, envisioning music as more than art, as a craft, a calling, and eventually a business. Those instincts, shaped by his father's discipline and the financial uncertainty of his youth, would later make him one of the shrewdest minds in the industry. Paul's early years were marked not by fame, but by fortitude. His childhood taught him that life could change in an instant, that love could be lost, and security could vanish. So, as his career began to take flight, his ambition wasn't fueled merely by the hunger for applause. For Paul, success meant safety. It meant building a life where the fear of losing everything, the way he had lost his mother, would never return. Beneath the charm, the wit, and the boyish grin, there was always a quiet determination to turn music into both art and armor. By the early 1960s, Paul McCartney's world had transformed. What began in small Liverpool halls had evolved into the Beatles, a force of nature that would change the very definition of popular culture. Paul, John, George, and Ringo were no longer just four lads chasing dreams. They were the epicenter of a global phenomenon. The haircuts, the harmonies, the hysteria, all of it seemed unstoppable. And at the heart of that whirlwind stood Paul McCartney, the basis of a poet's heart and a businessman's mind, navigating the dawn of a new musical age. But before the records, before the wealth and the accolades, there was just a boy sitting at a piano, haunted by loss, driven by melody, and fueled by an unshakable belief that songs could change everything. And in his case, they did. Paul McCartney, the craftsman of harmony, melody, and tireless discipline, entered his era of transformation in the smoke-filled clubs of Hamburg, Germany. There, the Beatles were not yet legends. They were young men fighting for survival, sharpening their sound one brutal night at a time. The shows were grueling marathons, 8 hours of relentless performance in front of drunken sailors, restless wanderers, and the occasional music lover who recognized that something extraordinary was brewing. Under the dim lights of the Reeperbahn, Paul's fingers toughened, his bass lines deepened, and his stage confidence caught fire. He learned how to command attention, how to connect with crowd, and how to transform exhaustion into energy. Hamburg forged the Beatles in steel, tight, raw, fearless. And Paul, ever the observer, understood that discipline wasn't just survival, it was destiny. When the band returned to Liverpool, that sharpened edge exploded onto the stage of the Cavern Club. It was a cramped, sweaty basement that smelled of beer and dreams, the birthplace of a cultural revolution. Teenagers packed shoulder to shoulder screamed as the band unleashed songs that felt both rebellious and pure. Among those in the audience, one day stood a young record shop owner named Brian Epstein. He saw what others only felt: the electricity, the potential, the possibility of something world-changing. Epstein polished their rough charm, encouraged them to wear suits, and turned four local lads into a national phenomenon. For Paul, Epstein was a perfect ally. Someone who shared his instinct for presentation and understood that style and substance could amplify each other. Together, they built not just a band, but a brand. Then came George Martin, the man who would become known as the fifth Beatle. A classically trained producer with the curiosity of a scientist and the patience of a teacher, Martin helped Paul unlock the full range of his musical imagination. Under Martin's guidance, Paul's melodic brilliance blossomed. Songs like Yesterday emerged not as mere pop hits, but as pieces of modern folklore. Recorded with nothing but Paul's voice, an acoustic guitar, and a string quartet, Yesterday became one of the most covered songs in history, a haunting blend of simplicity and sophistication that confirmed Paul's ability to transcend rock and roll itself. By 1964, Beatlemania had reached critical mass. The band's arrival in America triggered scenes of hysteria never before witnessed in popular music. When they appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, 73 million viewers tuned in, nearly half the U.S. population. Paul's wide-eyed grin, effortless charm, and sweet voice made him the heartthrob of the group. John was a rebel, George the mystic, Ringo the clown, but Paul was a romantic, the approachable everyman whose melodies seemed to speak directly to the listener's heart. Teenage girls scrawled his name on notebooks, and young musicians across the world picked up guitars, trying to capture his sound. In just a few short years, Paul McCartney had become more than a musician. He was an icon. The Beatles' creative evolution was relentless. From A Hard Day's Night to Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Paul's fingerprints were everywhere. He brought orchestral sweep to Eleanor Rigby, playful nostalgia to Penny Lane, and surreal innovation to Tomorrow Never Knows. Each new album felt like a reinvention, and Paul often served as the driving force behind that artistic momentum. But while the world was dazzled by the music, Paul was quietly learning another, less glamorous but equally vital skill: the business of music itself. When the band's publishing company, Northern Songs, was established to manage their catalog, Paul and John were given shares. To many, it seemed like a minor administrative detail, but Paul noticed something others overlooked. Ownership was power. The true wealth of music lay not just in the applause or the record sales, but in who controlled the rights to the songs. That realization would guide his financial and artistic choices for decades to come. By the late 1960s, the Beatles were beginning to fracture under the pressure of fame and conflicting visions. Yet amid the chaos, Paul often emerged as a glue, the one who pushed the group to continue recording, to keep their focus on the craft. He steered the creative direction of Let It Be and helped shape the brilliance of Abbey Road, their final masterpiece. His perfectionism sometimes caused tension, but it was also what ensured the band's swan songs were among their greatest works. When the Beatles finally disbanded in 1970, the world mourned. For Paul, the breakup was devastating, but it was also clarifying. Beneath the heartbreak, he carried the instincts, the drive, and the foresight to move forward alone. Paul's debut solo album, McCartney, released that same year, was a radical departure from the lush productions of the Beatles. Recorded mostly at home, it was raw, intimate, and deeply personal. Critics were divided, some confused, others dismissive, but one song, Maybe I'm Amazed, cut through all doubt. Written for his wife, Linda, it revealed the emotional core that had always defined Paul's music. Vulnerability wrapped in melody. It was proof that even stripped of the Beatles, his songwriting genius remained intact. Determined to build something new, Paul formed Wings with Linda and guitarist Denny Laine. The road ahead wasn't easy. Early tours were modest, critics skeptical, and success slow to arrive. But Paul's relentless work ethic once again paid off. By the mid-1970s, Wings had become one of the biggest bands on the planet, producing chart-topping hits like Band on the Run, Live and Let Die, and silly love songs. Stadiums filled once more, and Paul reclaimed his throne, not as an ex-Beatle, but as a global superstar in his own right. With fame came fortune, but also foresight. Paul began to invest his earnings wisely in real estate, art, farms, and most importantly, publishing rights. He had learned from the painful lesson of losing control of the Beatles' catalog. Now, he was determined to ensure that his future and his family's would never depend on anyone else's pen or contract. Quietly and methodically, he acquired publishing rights to songs by other artists, building a portfolio that would one day make him one of the wealthiest musicians in history. By 1979, Paul McCartney's transformation was complete. He was no longer merely a former Beatle, nor just a hitmaker. He was an empire unto himself, an artist, entrepreneur, and visionary. That year, Guinness World Records named him the most successful composer and recording artist in history. His songs had sold millions, his tours shattered records, and his influence reached every corner of the globe. Paul McCartney had proven what few artists ever could, that reinvention was not a retreat from the past, but a reclamation of it, turning fleeting fame into lasting power and melodies into a legacy that would outlive them all. For all his triumphs, Paul McCartney's story is not merely one of melodies and medals. It is also a chronicle of loss, betrayal, and endurance. Even at the height of fame, Paul remained restless, driven by a hunger that success could never quite satisfy. The 1980s opened with both triumph and tragedy, a decade that would test not only his artistry, but his humanity. In December 1980, the world was shattered by an event that seemed almost impossible to comprehend. John Lennon, Paul's former bandmate and creative soulmate, was murdered outside his New York apartment. The news tore through headlines, radio stations, and television screens. The end of an era sealed in gunfire. Paul, caught off guard by the world's glare, muttered a brief, awkward comment to reporters calling John's death a drag. The tabloids crucified him for it, painting him as cold or detached. But behind closed doors, Paul was devastated. John Lennon was not just another musician. He was the other half of the greatest songwriting partnership in history. Their relationship had been turbulent, filled with rivalry, affection, and pride. Yet beneath it all ran a bond as profound as family. Losing John was not only the death of a friend, it was the loss of the one person who truly understood the weight of the Beatles' shared past. Professionally, Paul carried on, refusing to let grief silence him. He poured himself into his work, collaborating with some of the biggest names of the era. His duets with Stevie Wonder, Ebony and Ivory, and Michael Jackson, Say Say Say, became international hits, showcasing his ability to adapt and thrive across generations. But even in success, life had its cruel ironies. During their friendship, Paul had once advised Michael Jackson to invest in music publishing, to buy song rights as a long-term asset. Jackson listened, In 1985, he outbid Paul to purchase ATV Music, the company that owned the Beatles' entire catalog. Overnight, the songs Paul had written, the very melodies that defined his youth, were owned by someone else. For Paul, it was a devastating reminder that even the world's most beloved artists could be outmaneuvered in business. It wasn't betrayal in a personal sense. Jackson had simply followed good advice, but it left Paul wounded, a visionary undone by his own counsel. Still, he persevered. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Paul reclaimed his place as both performer and a cultural statesman. His world tours drew millions. Critics who once dismissed him as the soft Beatle began to recognize the enduring sophistication of his work. In 1997, Queen Elizabeth II knighted him, and Sir Paul McCartney officially entered the pantheon of British royalty. His concerts became generational pilgrimages, grandparents, parents, and children all singing Hey Jude together beneath glowing stadium lights. Few artists in history had maintained relevance for so long, and fewer still had done it with such grace. By that time, Paul McCartney was no longer just a musician. He was an institution, a billionaire in the making, a businessman who transformed songs into assets and melodies into markets. His empire stretched far beyond the stage, encompassing publishing deals, art collections, and real estate across continents. Yet, through it all, he never stopped performing. For Paul, applause wasn't vanity, it was oxygen. No amount of wealth could replace the sound of a crowd singing Let It Be. The roar of thousands of voices united by one melody remained his greatest treasure. But behind the endless smiles and sold-out arenas lay shadows, personal struggles that revealed the fragility of even the most iconic lives. The first fracture had come decades earlier with the loss of his mother, Mary. Though time had passed, that wound never fully healed. When Linda McCartney, his wife, muse, and creative partner, was diagnosed with breast cancer in the late 1990s, it was as if history repeated itself with cruel precision. For Paul, Linda had been the calm after the Beatles' storm. Together, they had built a family, created music, and carved out a private world far from the chaos of fame. Her illness shattered that peace. Paul stood by her side through every treatment and every dark night until her death in 1998. It was a blow that nearly broke him. Later, he confessed that losing Linda felt like the center of his life had disappeared, that the woman who had been his compass was suddenly gone. Grief led him to seek companionship again, and in 2002, he married Heather Mills. At first, the union seemed like a new beginning, but soon, headlines once again intruded. Their relationship deteriorated publicly, and by 2008, their divorce had become one of the most bitter and sensational in celebrity history. Mills accused Paul of cruelty. Paul denied it. The media feasted on every detail. The settlement cost him tens of millions, but the emotional cost was far greater. The same tabloids that once celebrated his love songs now dissected his heartbreak. The shadows weren't limited to relationships. In 1980, just before John's death, Paul had been arrested in Tokyo for marijuana possession. He spent 9 days in Japanese jail, a surreal fall from grace for one of the world's most famous musicians. Though he later laughed it off as a rock star misstep, the incident revealed the precarious balance he maintained between rebellion and respectability. He would later admit that his cannabis use had been heavy, at times even disruptive to his family life. It was a reminder that behind the polished legend stood a man still grappling with the same flaws and temptations as anyone else. Then there was a business battlefield, the long shadow of the Beatles' lost catalog. Watching his life's work pass through corporate hands remained a lifelong frustration. Decades later, Paul began regaining ownership of portions of the Lennon-McCartney songs, but the scars of that loss lingered. It taught him that in the music industry, even geniuses could be pawns in games of contracts and control. Yet perhaps Paul's greatest struggle wasn't with money or reputation. It was with survival itself. Unlike John Lennon and George Harrison, Paul lived on, carrying not only his own legacy but theirs as well. Every time he stepped onto a stage to sing Yesterday or Hey Jude, he felt their absence like ghosts in the harmonies. Fans heard joy. Paul often felt solitude. He once admitted that performing Beatles songs without his bandmates left him haunted. A man forever chasing the sound of voices that time had silenced. Critics, too, left their marks. For decades, Paul was accused of being the sentimental Beatle, too polished, too safe. Songs like Silly Love Songs were mocked as lightweight, while John's darker lyrics were hailed as profound. Paul rarely fought back. He let the music speak, trusting history to judge him fairly. But the sting of those comparisons never truly faded. And then, the burden of wealth, the irony of success. Forbes lists and financial reports routinely measured him in dollars and pounds, reducing a lifetime of artistry to spreadsheets. But Paul himself has admitted that money complicates life as much as it secures it. Behind the billions lie the same wounds, grief, betrayal, and doubt that in the end, Paul McCartney's dark side is not defined by scandal, but by humanity, the losses that shaped him, the betrayals that humbled him, and the endurance that kept him singing. His true story is not one of perfection, but persistence, the melody that refuses to fade, even when the lights dim and the stage grows quiet. For more than half a century, Paul McCartney has carried not just a legacy, but myth, a symbol of creativity, endurance, and grace under the most relentless spotlight in modern culture. Yet behind the polished charm and effortless smile lies a far more complex truth. The tragedies of his life have peeled away the layers of legend, revealing a man who, despite fame and fortune, remains profoundly human, vulnerable, sometimes broken, but always determined to move forward. Beneath the shadows of loss and expectation, Paul never truly stopped. He kept writing. He kept performing. Each heartbreak became another verse, every setback another chorus, every silence another reason to create. His struggles were not the unraveling of his story. They were the foundation of his resilience. For all the world knows about Paul McCartney, the sold-out stadiums, the diamond-certified records, the knightly grace of a pop monarch, there exists another Paul, the cautious strategist, the grieving son, the restless creator who never allowed success to lull him into complacency. To understand how he became not just a legend but a billionaire, one must look beyond the songs and see the architecture of his mind, the way he built, protected, and reinvented his art across 6 decades. The first truth is this: Paul McCartney was never just an artist. He was an architect. Even in the earliest Beatles days, he thought like a builder, not just a dreamer. Under the guidance of manager Brian Epstein, it was Paul who insisted the band wear suits, tighten their arrangements, and polish their image. He understood, even as a teenager from Liverpool, that charisma needed discipline and art demanded structure. Where John Lennon brought fire and rebellion, Paul brought form and refinement. This balance didn't only elevate their sound, it laid the groundwork for one of the greatest cultural empires in history. His vision wasn't about selling out. It was about standing out. He saw that brilliance could fade without order, that raw talent needed architecture to last. The second truth lies in ownership. Paul's obsession with publishing rights is often portrayed as ruthless business acumen, but at its core, it was born of pain. When he lost control of the Lennon-McCartney catalog, the songs that defined his life, it wasn't just a financial blow, it was emotional theft. Watching others profit from the melodies that came from his heart haunted him for decades. Determined never to be powerless again, he quietly began acquiring publishing rights to songs by Buddy Holly, Carl Perkins, and hundreds of others. By the 21st century, his catalog was one of the most valuable in music history. What the world saw as strategy was, in truth, survival. The instinct of a boy from post-war Liverpool who had grown up knowing what it meant to go without. Then comes the third truth. Paul McCartney's life is shaped as much by grief as by melody. The death of his mother when he was 14 left an invisible wound that echoed through Yesterday and Let It Be. John Lennon's murder shattered him in ways words could never capture. George Harrison's passing in 2001 reopened those old wounds, reminding him that he was outliving the voices that once harmonized beside him. And when Linda, his wife, muse, and anchor, lost her battle with cancer in 1998, Paul was left unmoored, stripped of stability that had grounded his post-Beatles world. Yet every time grief tried to silence him, Paul turned to music. Each tragedy became another song, another testament to his ability to turn pain into art. His melodies are not escapes from sorrow. They are dialogues with it. The fourth truth, resilience through reinvention. When the tides of taste turned against him, when punk mocked his generation, when critics dismissed him as sentimental, Paul adapted. He experimented with electronic music, collaborated with younger artists, and kept evolving. Decades after the Beatles, he was still filling stadiums in the 70s, performing 3-hour shows with a voice weathered but unmistakably his own. Each reinvention was not about chasing relevance, but about proving that creation itself was his lifeblood. Perhaps the most surprising truth, however, is that Paul's fortune has never been his true treasure. Despite his billionaire status, those closest to him describe a man still grounded, someone who can stroll into a pub unnoticed, who still writes by hand, who finds joy not in luxury but in melody. His wealth, vast as it is, became a shield, protection against the insecurity of his childhood, not the purpose of his life. The real currency for Paul McCartney has always been music. The rush of a chorus sung by 50,000 voices, the trembling joy of a piano melody taking form in an empty studio, the unbreakable communion between artist and audience. And then comes a legacy. Paul McCartney is not merely a man. He is a bridge, a living connection between generations. To the young, he is history made flesh. To the old, he is living memory. Few figures have managed to remain both museum and future. Yet Paul walks that line with quiet grace. His songs have outlived decades, trends, and even the boundaries of mortality, reminding us that while bodies age, melody does not. In the end, the hidden truth of Paul McCartney is beautifully simple. He never stopped being that boy from Liverpool who lost his mother and feared instability. The fame, the fortune, the knighthood, all of it became armor, built not just to protect his music, but to protect his heart. Behind every billion-dollar empire lies a human being trying to endure, to find meaning, to keep singing through the storm. Paul McCartney's story, at its core, isn't about money or even music. It's about transformation. It's about turning loss into legacy, fleeting applause into immortality. Because when the lights dim and the crowd sings "Hey Jude" back to him in perfect unison, Paul McCartney is reminded that connection, that moment of shared humanity, has always been his truest empire.